In Rush for Riches, J.S. Holliday describes California's gold rush era and how it defined that state's image as a place of opportunity and freedom. Mr. Holliday is a director emeritus at the California Historical Society. He spoke at the San Francisco Public Library for about 80 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you, Michael. Thank you each and all for being here in this elegant auditorium. I am grateful to be here, and I intend to keep you alert and awake for 35, 40 minutes, and then I look forward to your questions. There's a wonderful aphorism which says that there is no such thing as dialogue, there is only interrupted monologue. Well, there will be a monologue. I hope you won't interrupt it too often while I think with you about the gold rush and its impact on this nation, and then the dialogue, and I look forward to that and to your questions. In 1850, the governor of California, the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, assessed the new 31st state, and he said, "Our state is a marvel to ourselves and a miracle to the world," which was not an exaggeration nor a boast, but indeed a surprise and a reality. It was his expression of, my God, what an amazing place I'm now in charge of. And 33 years later, in 1883, the Overland Monthly, the first magazine publication in California to reach a national audience, widely read, editor Bret Hart. In 1883, the Overland Monthly assessed California and used a wonderfully thoughtful and provocative phrase, described California as America, only more so. Now, how could it be that a place so neglected by Spain and by Mexico, so far removed from the world in 1848, 1849, 1850, could have achieved such instant fame, could have achieved such a magnetic attraction, developed such a magnetic attraction in such a very short time, and by 1883, only 33 years later, be judged to be the epitome of America, America only more so. How did that happen? And of course we know, and it's true, I think, that the answer is, well, the gold rush, the gold discovery and the gold rush is the driving force that developed California, created this magnificent image, developed the economy, created the state that was indeed a miracle, was indeed a marvel to its residents. And it's true, and we want to think about how it was that the gold rush did that, but in order to understand the means by which the gold rush could have evolved and could have had that impact, we have to consider how it was possible for the gold rush to develop this kind of a society, this kind of an economy so quickly. It could not have happened anywhere else. I'm very confident of that. I spend considerable time exploring and developing the idea that it could not, the gold rush could not have occurred in any other place at that time except in California. And it is because it happened in California that we therefore had the gold rush and had all that evolved thereby and became released the forces that shaped California and reshaped America's expectations. My point is that California was a place unique in its serendipitous qualities, allowing the gold rush to occur. Unique, think about it. Settlement here didn't occur till 1769, and 76 years later, no, 77 years later, in 1846, 76 years later, after Spain had managed and mismanaged California and Mexico had taken over in 1821 and neglected this province, all those years, California was a Siberia in the Spanish Empire, a neglected province in the Mexican struggle of attaining its own identity. In all of those years, from 1769 to 1846, 77 years, only 8,000 people came to California. Only 8,000 settlers moved to this place. One would think with the majestic image that we have of it today that it would have attracted many more. Only 8,000 people were here. That's a major reason why the gold rush could occur, because there was no development of government, no development of institutions, of cities. California was an astonishingly primitive place, much more primitive than the romanticization of it, I think, has let us realize. It's only 8,000 people here, non-Indians in 1846. No bridges, no library, no hospital, no roads. A place remarkably backward. The place that we think of as so successful today was then a place that was devoid of the amenities of life and of the structures that we call to mind in terms of a government. In 1847, when the United States took over, 1848, when we had signed a treaty with Mexico and we had acquired California, Governor Mason, the military governor here, had only a few hundred soldiers under his command, so few that when gold was discovered, he realized there was no way that this astounding treasure could be controlled by the government which owned the gold. And so California began at the very time of its birth, the moment when it burst upon the world's consciousness, as a place of remarkable freedoms and almost indeed anarchy. Very few people here, no government here, very few Indians left native people who could be an obstacle to the influx, the invasion of tens and scores and finally hundreds of thousands of people. No ownership of land beyond the ranchos who owned so much they didn't know where their boundaries were. No sense of control. And so when the people who came as gold seekers arrived, they were in the unique situation of being able to take the gold and pocket it and leave. Where else in the world could that have happened? If gold had been discovered in North Carolina and been discovered in Spain and Italy, on the coasts of Africa, wherever, there would have been tremendous difficulties. The militia, the government would have taken charge, would have said, this is our gold. You people coming in, stay out. We're not going to let you just come rushing in. There would have been objections. There would have been fences, literal and figurative, to say, no, this is my gold. Buster, you stay out. You can't just come wandering in and rushing in and taking it away. In California, there were no taxes collected. No licenses had to be filled out. No one here to say this is mine. Always in the history of the world, when you think about the history of the treasure of gold being sought, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, whomever, all through the centuries, through the 1,000 years, the Greeks and the Romans, gold had belonged to the king. Gold had belonged to the aristocrats. Gold had belonged to whoever lived on the castle up on the hilltop. Gold had been the prideful possession of people in power. There were no people in power in California. So California begins as a place uniquely open to the freedom that allowed the miners to take the gold and go home with it. I suggest that that is in itself, and it's a theme that can be much more developed than I'm now taking time, that is the key to understanding California, because it is in the context of such freedom and such astonishing opportunity, free for all, gold free for all, plenty for all, open to anyone and everyone. It is in that context that California was able to burgeon and grow so rapidly. People came to California not only because they knew the gold was here, not only because President Polk said, yes, it's true, there is an abundance of gold. We've all heard of his great statement to Congress on the 12th of December of 1848, confirming the rumors, confirming what Larkin had said. But it was much more than the promise of the president that you would find gold in California. It was the promise of knowing that you were free to take it and not pay any taxes, not have any restrictions, and go home with it. It was the freedom of the gold discovery, the freedom of taking it, that made it all possible. And in the context of that freedom, we developed in California, it seems to me, the contagion and the environment of entrepreneurial daring, entrepreneurialism, opportunity for taking on great risks, because California was not only this place of freedom where there were no controls from the point of view of a government or institutions. It was also a place that began with a unique population, obviously. Obviously, I say, because you all know, we make a great point of the fact that this was a masculine society, overwhelmingly masculine. The people who came to California, the pioneers who came here, didn't come, they weren't pioneers, they didn't come as pioneers, they came as takers, they came to be able and quick in grabbing the gold and ravaging the land and going back to Maryland, back to Michigan, and build a fortune, having made a fortune in California, build a new life back home with their family. They left their families, they left their futures back in the States, in Bordeaux, in Hamburg, wherever they came from. And it was the future that would be built with California gold back at home. So they came to California intending not to build this place, but to take from it. In that context, a place where there are no rules, no controls, people began their lives and began the settlement of California with a sense of freedom that was unique and never seen before. A place not only of freedom, of remarkable opportunity, but a place immediately urban. California is unlike all other frontiers for these reasons, and the fact that it's an urban place to begin with. Think of how quickly San Francisco was settled, how quickly Sacramento grew up, and Sonora, and Marysville. These were places of urban development, urban strength, and they were then as well great consumer markets. What other frontier began with as a great consumer market? Other frontiers had been places of sparse settlement, places where subsistence agriculture predominated, places where people were self-sufficient and had a little money. California was unique in the fact that it was affluent with a tremendous amount of gold being found. It was urban. It was a consumer market. It was overwhelmingly masculine. It was a place without rules and controls, a place where there were no mothers, very few wives, no preachers, no Sunday sermons, no admonitions as to how to behave, very few inhibitions, traditions, constraints, freedom in every sense of the word. And those combined circumstances developed in California a place that projected into the world's consciousness an image of a place where you could strike it rich, where you could behave in any way you wanted to, where there would be no controls on your social, moral, political, economic behavior. Never had there been such a place as that before. And that image was planted in the world's awareness by the thousands of letters, by the newspaper reports, by the books, by the thousands of men who returned home, and California's image as a place of freedom and opportunity spread immediately, and by the 1850s it was indeed a marvel and a miracle. And indeed, America only more so, because America represented to the world, and always had from 1607, from the time we began settlement of the New World, California was a place where a man and his family could make a living. That's what America represented, a place to make a living. You couldn't make a living with any confidence in Germany and Italy and England. You could suffer. You were a serf, a peasant. Your future was dependent upon a stratified society. Who knew what his future might hold, other than maybe a furrow every morning working in the same field his grandfather had worked in. In California, California offered not a place to make a living, but a place to make a fortune. A place to make a fortune. There had never been such a thing before. So it becomes an immense attraction to the world, and the world did rush into California beginning in 1850 and continuing, 1849 and continuing, and as a place then of immense attraction, it developed an economy and a society unique to itself. I think that if we place this sense of California's growth and development in the context of these freedoms, which are so unusual, and how it came about that these freedoms were possible in California because of the primitiveness of California at the time the United States took over and at the time the gold was discovered, we'll have a better understanding of the character and the nature, the psyche of California. I think this state began as almost in a genetic way. Kevin Starr, the state librarian, has suggested it's a DNA. It's part of California's DNA that we begin with this character of freedom and of opportunity, of optimism, a contagion of high hopes and high expectations. And that became the case because of the character of California in the 1850s. Let me read to you an example or a explication of what I'm talking about. I think it speaks to it well. I hope it does. I've worked for years in writing all of this, and I'm going to ask you, you can take a few minutes and listen to it. Like a rich, outlandish uncle, envied for his wealth and even more for his free and easy ways, California in its second and third decades continued to reinvent its society, as different from other states as, indeed, from any nation. Magazine and newspaper articles and numerous books exclaimed over its wonders and excesses. No one characterized its spirit more accurately than not yet famous Sam Clemens, newly arrived in 1864. He said, "It was a driving, vigorous, restless population that gave to California a name for getting up astounding enterprises and rushing them through with a magnificent dash and daring and recklessness of cost or consequence. In those new decades," unquote, "in those new decades of exuberance, sustained by California's seemingly limitless fecundity, who cared to question the success and wealth produced by miners, merchants, and other risk-takers? Who cared about forests destroyed, hills washed away, rivers diverted into flumes, or clogged with gravel and silt? Who cared about native people driven from their ancient homeland, those devils in the forest, who were hunted and shot if they did not flee? Why find fault when everyone hoped to profit from one of those astounding enterprises? No time for scruple about tomorrow's consequences, for moral judgments, for empathy with California land-grant families whose vast ranchos were lost to Americans with new laws and crafty lawyers. As in the past, so in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, legislators in Sacramento remained petty, needy men, easily got at, while judges and city and county officials were as responsive as ever to an illicit envelope. So stand back, make way for the hydraulicers, the wheat ranchers, railroad builders, stockbrokers, and tycoons of commerce. What mattered were profits booked and more expected. More. That was the guiding principle. And with California's outrageous luck, more began to seem like a universal right. Not only more gold from hydraulic mining, but silver too, discovered in the phenomenally rich vein known as the Comstock Lode on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. Californians rushed to this remote site, where in 1860 they put up a town called Virginia City, at first as wild as any other bivouac of tents and shacks, but soon more pretentious and far more rich. In torrid tunnels as deep as 3,000 feet beneath its streets, wage-earning miners drilled, blasted, and hoisted to the surface ore worth $300 million between the years 1860 and 1880. A bounty even greater than the $270 million extracted from California's hydraulic and quartz mines in the same decades. So much wealth, so many presumed opportunities attracted new thousands each year from around the world. By 1870, 39% of California's population was foreign-born, 218,000 out of 560,000. Where else but in this unique society would Irish and Chinese compete, sometimes fighting in the streets, for jobs, as they did in San Francisco in 1877. Of course, immigrants from the eastern states continued to arrive by ship via Panama, and many more would come by transcontinental railroad. 175,000 came to California by the railroad in 1873, 74, and 75, after California's entrepreneurs dared to conquer the heights of the Sierra to tie the Pacific state by iron to the federal union. Even the state's most fanciful boosters of the 1850s could not have forecast the wonders of those decades, that wives and children in the cities, even in a few mining camps, would outnumber bartenders and prostitutes, that San Francisco would have more millionaires than Boston and New York, that 4 local dry goods merchants in Sacramento would muster the ambition and the know-how to direct construction of the railroad that ended California's timeless isolation in 1869. That mining corporations, some owned by London investors, would build a vast network of Sierra reservoirs and ditches and iron pipes to carry billions of gallons of water to giant nozzles that washed away entire mountainsides. That after decades of profiting from their domineering freedom, the miner would be challenged, even constrained, by the rising outrage of the farmer, leading to an irrepressible conflict. Let me read one more example, and then I'll go on. Rudyard Kipling came to San Francisco in 1889, already famous, a man wise to the world. And this is what he said on traveling, walking the streets of this city. "Recklessness is in the air. I can't explain where it comes from, but there it is. The roaring winds off the Pacific make you drunk with it. The aggressive luxury on all sides helps out with the intoxication. Californians make greatly and spend lavishly. The young men at 20 are experienced in business, embark on vast enterprises, take partners as experienced as themselves, and go to pieces with as much splendor as their neighbors. Remember that the men who stocked California in the 50s were physically, and as far as regards certain tough virtues, the pick of the earth. The inept and the weakly died en route and went under in the days of construction." Now that's the view of Kipling. What I read to you is an introduction to chapter 6, and it seems to me that it suggests what I'm stressing, that California is this place beyond anything else that we've ever known, because it had within its lack of social order, within its lack of family life, an opportunity for men to behave and to chase after their own selfish interest. This sense of get mine now was the driving energy and the driving ambition of everyone. A man from Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild, came out here in 1850, and he hung around for years, as did so many, and he wrote a letter back to his family, and this is what he said. He said, "The excitement and the liberality here and the rapid march of this country make a man feel sad at the prospect of returning to the old beaten path at home." Not a letter a wife wants to receive, but exactly reflective of the kind of feeling that so many tens of thousands of men experienced. They had come here with high hopes and with great expectations. They had promised to return home. They had every intention of returning with a pocket full of rocks. And so many thousands of them did return. I think many more of them successful than we have generally assumed. But of course, many, many thousands more stayed in California. The statistics are at hand. We know from the harbor master how many people left each year. In 1852, 32,800 left from San Francisco because they all went home by ship. And by the way, of that 32,000, only 8 were women, which suggests how few women there were here, but also suggests what a remarkable place this was for women and the opportunity that they could find here. Always been true. So this was a place unlike any other, and it was so much a place of masculine enterprise and masculine endeavor that a great many men found it difficult to go home to the old beaten path at home. Here you could get a loan very easily, and the interest rates were high, but you could get a loan and compared to some starchy banker back in Albany or in Indianapolis or Chicago who would say no. People began to realize that this was a place that more than just a place to make gold, to make money, to make a fortune, a place where you could have a life unlike anywhere else. And they stayed for that reason. We think of the gold rush, I think, too often as a woebegone tale of men who came and who failed. And that's the story we hear all the time, the 49er who came and then he went home and hadn't made a great deal of money. My first book tells of such a man, William Swain, who returned with less money than he might have had if he'd stayed at home. And there was that cycle of people coming here with high hopes and returning with disappointment. But the proof is abundantly evident that California was immensely successful, affluent from the very beginning and continued to be, which is why the population continued to grow, why in the 1870s, I just told you, 175,000 people came here by the new transportation system, the Transcontinental Railroad, why California, with risk and daring, built its own railroad across the isthmus in 1855, the first transcontinental railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific, built by Americans across the isthmus of Panama, so that people could more easily get to California and come home from California. Everywhere you look, you see a place of risk-taking, a place of remarkable enterprise and opportunity for making a go of it, for getting mine now, and not just in mining. Let me give you some examples of the ways in which this affluent economy held on to the people who came in 49 and the 50s and who lingered and stayed for so many years and attracted so many tens of thousands more through the decades. You could make so much money in so many different ways. San Francisco was the great port into which flowed the needs, all the shoes, the shovels, the dynamite, not dynamite, the black powder, the wheat, the canned oysters, the whiskey, all that was the shirts and the pants, everything that the tens of thousands of men and 100,000 miners worked up and down the western slopes of the Sierra all through the 1850s, and 60 and 80,000 in the 1850s, 100,000, and 1860s, 50 to 60,000 were still there. We have this enormous consumer market, and San Francisco is the place where it comes in, and then it's transported from San Francisco up the Sacramento River to Sacramento. Tremendous amount of opportunity in owning steamships to carry those supplies and people from San Francisco to Sacramento. Then in Sacramento, what a great city that was. We in San Francisco were so narcissistic and so aware of the history and the wonder of this city that we obscure and forget the wonder of Sacramento. That was the mother city, more than San Francisco, of the mining camps and of the miners. There's the place where all the supplies were taken by ship to Sacramento. This state didn't have a railroad until 1856, and the little railroad that ran from Sacramento to Folsom. It was the economic artery of California was the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River. Beautifully, how lucky it was located, right where it needed to be, from San Francisco, from the bay, right up to Sacramento, which was there, a place where you could go from there up into the hills. So Sacramento offered a tremendous opportunity as well in terms of making money. The supplies came to Sacramento, and from there they were hauled by wagon up to Placerville, to Nevada City, to Georgetown. The wagons carried thousands of tons of supplies to the men up there, to the mining camps, all the equipment, all the machinery, everything that they needed. And when it got to the places like Auburn and Nevada City, and they couldn't go any further with the wagons, there it was shipped, carried on the backs of mountain clippers, the mules that carried 200 and 300 pounds per mule and carried the supplies up into the darkest reaches, the worst little back camps, places like Gaujai and Dogtown and one beautiful little town, mining camp. They're all ugly places, but what a name. Ladies' Crevice was the name of one of the mining camps. So up into those places you could carry supplies, and you could charge 25, 30 cents, 50 cents, $1 a pound. Easy to make money freighting, easy to make money with mules, with a chain of mules, pack mules carrying supplies. Over and over again, these mining camps, these towns burned. The conflagration was fire was the great scourge, the great danger, and much more than cholera. And when the towns burned down, the order for supplies came back down to Sacramento. We need more wood, we need iron shutters, we need more bricks, we need everything that was destroyed in the fire. And Sacramento would be flooded with the needs of these mining camps, and then the supplies would be taken out. And the same thing, of course, the orders would come all the way down here to San Francisco. There was so many other ways in terms of this being a masculine society, a place where men needed a bathhouse, they needed hotels, they needed restaurants, bars, gambling halls, bordellos, and these were enterprises you could start very easily with very little money. And they were gushing profits. There were people making $8,000 and $10,000 and $12,000 a year with a bowling alley, with a bathhouse. In Kentucky, you might make a living running a restaurant. In San Francisco, you could make a hell of a lot of money running a restaurant, or in the mining camps. So here is a place of multiple opportunities, and these opportunities encourage people to take risks such as they wouldn't take at home. At home, your family is watching. You've got relatives at hand, and you don't want to fail. You don't want to enter into a business that might not be in tune with the values of your aunt and your uncle or your mother-in-law. But who here cares? One of the factors that influence people's lives in California is a phrase that I use and I think is very evocative: the freedom of anonymity. The freedom of anonymity. Your family isn't here. There's no one watching hometown. There are no hometown eyes. And so you're free to dare, to be greedy, to be ambitious, to be risk-taking, to cut corners that you wouldn't think of doing back home under the gaze of your relatives. And in that environment, that freedom of anonymity, people were risk-takers, people were entrepreneurial in ways they might not ever have been anywhere else. We're dealing with unique circumstances that combine and contrive to create this driving energy of ambition, forces released in California unlike forces to be found any place else. Now, one of the reasons this is all happening is because the freedom is such that the miner has never had anyone say no to him. When the miners came in '49 from all over the world, as we suggested, there's no one here to say this gold is mine. It didn't belong to anyone. The government didn't have control over it. And so the miner from the very beginning was in a position of authority and power. His own authority, his own power. No one to say no, and he remained in that position through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s. I think of these as the careless, exuberant decades of California's youth. A time when there was a wildness, when there was this recklessness that Kipling found even in the 1880s. And these decades were ones of freedom and carelessness and exuberance because there was no one here to say no, and because gold mining was producing so much wealth. $594 million in the decade of the 1850s, rounded off to $600 million in the 1850s. Multiply by 19 to get the value today, you've got $10 billion produced by mining enterprise in California in the 1850s. The population of California in 1860 was 340,000 people. Pump $10 billion into a society of 300,000 people. It's unique. It's never been anything like it. When California had 340,000 people in 1860, Oregon had 54,000 people. The image of California had made the great difference, and the image is that of freedom and of making money and of opportunity, as compared to Oregon, where Oregon is like back home. There's churches in Oregon and family and ministers and people shaking their finger at you on Sunday, and the word sin is even brought up in Oregon. So things are very different here in California, and it's that freedom that continues to bring people here. In the power of the miner, he is in a position, and consider what he was allowed to do. Not only, of course, just to find the gold and dig it out in the 1848 and 49 and the early 50s, as we know, and we read the Pan and the Rocker and the sluices and all, but river mining, the Yuba, the Feather, the McCollum, all the wonderful rushing streams flowing down the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. You look down in those green swirling waters and you think, my God, think how much gold is down there. We worked the banks, we worked all around. The gold down there, think of it. How do I get at it? No one to say no. You build a dam, you block the river, you divert all the water of that river in September. By that time, the water has diminished due to the runoff from the Sierra snowpack. You divert the river behind the dam into a flume, and you built a flume. You and your partners built this flume yourself. You built it with the trees that grew up and down along the road, along the side of the stream, trees that belonged to the United States government. The government hadn't surveyed it. No one here to say you can't cut those trees down. They cut down thousands of acres of trees, leaving a stubble of stumps. And with those trees, they cut them into planks, and they built a flume. And with the flume, they moved the water out of the river. And then they could work the bottom of the river, the bed of the river, and dig out the gold with the old technology of rockers and long toms. And then in the fall, when the river rose because of the first rainstorms, the volume of water was greater than the flume could hold, and the flume broke apart. And every single fall, those great creations, that energy developed into building those flumes, was all washed away and destroyed and scattered downstream, making havoc along the way. Nobody ever said no. 25 miles of the Yuba River were flumed in that fashion, and other rivers equally so. Think of the damage that did in terms of the natural habitat. Could you imagine that happening in France, in Italy, in North Carolina, in Massachusetts? Where else in the world could a group of foreigners, transients, people from God knows what other part of the world come right in and tear up the place? And they did. Bayard Taylor came to California, and he looked around and he saw some of the ravaging that had been done by the miners, and he described the scene, and he said, "This place makes one think of a princess who has been captured by bandits, who cut off her fingers for the jewels she wore." California's miners had ravaged the earth to take the treasure of the earth out, to dig it out, blast it out, tear open the earth, and to take the treasure as pirates and bandits might capture a princess and cut off her fingers in order to take her jewelry. That was the picture, that's the metaphor. And no one said no to the miners. And then when the miners, advancing their technology, allied with science, greed and science allied to produce the great wonder of hydraulic mining. Hydraulic mining, never been anything like it before or since. Hydraulic mining, as you know what it is, the technology bringing water down by under great pressure through pipes, and then it comes out through these monitors. They're 6 and 8 and 10 feet long, 5 and 8 and 10 foot, 5 and 8 and 6 and 8 and 6, 9-inch diameter openings at the nozzle, and the water blasting out, a great jet striking against a hillside 100 yards away, demolishing the hillside, washing down the accumulated gravel and rock from ancient riverbeds in which were found particles of gold. Those monitors, that hydraulic mining, washed, and I can tell you exactly the figure, washed 1,295,000,000 cubic yards of gravel, rock, and sand into the tributaries of the Sacramento River. No one said no. No one, until, as we'll see, until finally the farmers rose up. But for all those years, beginning in 1853, when hydraulic mining was invented, 50s through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, right up to 1884, that kind of destructiveness, of washing the gravel and the rock and the sand down from these hillsides into the rivers, into the creeks, and finally into the Bear River, the Feather River, the Yuba River, and the American River. All of them, that's the major rivers where hydraulic mining took place. The total amount, I gave you the figure, maybe it'd be more interesting to have it another way. The total volume of gravel, rock, and sand washed by hydraulic mining was greater, was 8 times the volume of gravel, rock, and sand moved in building the Panama Canal. That's what the wonder of these years, the exuberance of these years, the power of the miner to get away with this. Producing $270 million in gold from the hydraulic mining operations. Now that kind of freedom was incomprehensible anyplace else in the world, and it was possibly because the miner came here and established his power and no one said no. The court system, the judicial system, which was improvised, which was impatient to say the least, was one designed to protect the interests of the miner. The vigilance committees took care of the miners' rights. The vigilance committees in the cities took care of the merchants' rights and interests. So hydraulic mining exemplifies the freedom of California's miners. And then what happened, and what I think has never been told except in one other book by a fellow named Robert Kelly, a wonderful book, Gold versus Grain, published in 1959. That book is the first book to deal with what this book develops. And this book tells how this freedom evolved and how it led to what I think of as the maturation of California, how California finally, in the 1880s, began to feel the constraint of the collective good, of society's interests, as compared to the rampaging self-interest of get mine now individual miners and individual mining companies. Hydraulic mining represents the power of the past, and farming begins in the 1860s to represent the power of the future. And these two powers come into an irrepressible conflict beginning in the 1860s. They do so because the hydraulic mining is washing down the gravel of the rock, the sand, what's called slickens, washing it down through these rivers. And the rivers, the river beds, which are 30 and 40, in the case of the Bear River, 80 feet deep, carrying water in these great old ancient riverbeds, fill up, completely fill up with gravel, rock, and sand, so that in the wintertime, where is the water going to go? And the water, of course, flows out all over the countryside. And there are terrible floods beginning in the 60s and the 70s. Devastating floods. Sacramento builds great levees to protect itself. Sacramento, we think of San Francisco as suffering from fires. Think what San Francisco never had any floods. San Francisco had only fires. Sacramento had fires, terrible cholera epidemic, had rioting, the squatter riots, but it had floods year after year. There was an arrogance about Sacramento, exemplary again of this sense of freedom, an arrogance of the merchants who put their city on a floodplain. They should never have built Sacramento right there at the mouth of the Sacramento and the American River. But they did, because that's where you could make the most money. Well, I'll cut through to tell you what they did. They not only built these levees, but finally they realized the only way they could protect this city from constant floods was to raise the entire city. They raised it 12 and 16 feet. They just took about the business of bringing in millions of tons of dirt, and they raised the whole city 12 feet so that it was above the floodplain. If you've been there and you've seen, you know the city, the first floor of many, many hundreds of buildings became the basement, and the second floor became the first floor, and they added buildings on top. It was an amazing enterprise. This book describes how that happened and why, exemplary of this sense of nothing is going to stand in the way, we're going to do any damn thing we have to make a profit, and that was the merchants in Sacramento. The farmers developed their activities and their planting of vegetables, of fruits, beginning in the 50s and the 60s. And this consumer market that I mentioned earlier, there is an enormous power of consumption in California. And so the farmers realize, here's a most remarkable opportunity. I may have left Illinois or France in order to get away from farming, but I can make more money in farming in California than the miners can, and they did. A fellow named Horner made $70,000 in one summer growing a crop of onions and selling that one crop of onions. People raised melons and onions and potatoes, all of which were very good in offsetting scurvy. And the profits that could be made in agriculture equaled the profits that could be made in mining. And the farmers used the land with the same kind of ruthless selfishness as did the miners. They were as impatient to make their fortunes as were the miners. And so they came into conflict with each other. And what an irony it is. The farmers are selling to the hundreds of thousands of, not the hundreds of thousands, the scores of thousands of miners and all those mining camps to Nevada City and Grass Valley and Auburn and Georgetown and Jackson, all those wonderful camps and towns and those great need, all the supplies that were sent up there by freight wagons and by mules. The farmers were selling their product, and the people they were selling it to were their enemies. The people they were selling it to were destroying the very land on which they grew the crops. The miners were washing down the slickens and washed and put gravel and rock and sand over 39,000 acres of farmland along the rivers, the Bear and the Feather, the Yuba and the American. And so the irony of a situation where farmers are making money selling to miners, and the miners are destroying the land of the farmers. And the farmers finally say, you have got to stop, you can't continue doing this. They bring lawsuits in the 60s and the 70s. They lose the lawsuits. Wonderfully descriptive. I think this is wonderfully descriptive in my book, but it's a wonderfully dramatic story of how these lawsuits are brought about, how the farmers hire lawyers and they go to the court and they struggle and it goes to the Supreme Court. The courts rule in favor of the miners over and over again, and the farmers are frustrated. And finally, in conclusion, and the book concludes with this, California grows up. California, in a dramatic change of ethos. The ethos of California changes from the selfish ambition, the ravaging of the earth, the destruction of the landscape, the transiency of the miner, to the permanence, to the long, deep-rootedness of the farmer, to the farmer who brings his family, who plans for the future, to the farmer who, unlike the miner, practices the oldest rule of life, which is you harvest what you have sown. You get back what you put in. The miner didn't put anything in. He went in and just took out. Well, that's not fair. They put in a hell of a lot. They built enormous equipments and the flumes, and they built great shafts, and they worked hard, and they spent millions of dollars to develop the technology to take out the gold, but they were destructive. So California shifted from the destructiveness of the miner to the reproductiveness of the farmer, and that occurred in a specific time, and I think it's a date that we should all keep in mind, and it's a date we should marry in our minds to the year 1849, and that date is 1884. In 1884, California changed because in that year the farmers brought a lawsuit against the North Bloomfield Gravel and Mining Company, and they sued in federal court. The reason it got into federal court is because the man who brought the lawsuit was a resident of New York City, and he could bring the lawsuit, bring the case to a court here in federal court in San Francisco. And the judge was a man named Lorenzo Sawyer, and he had been a miner himself. And so when the miners found that he was going to be the judge, they thought, aha, we've got a friend on our side. And Judge Sawyer went up to the Bear and the Yuba and the Feather, and he looked at the dams that had been built to hold back the Slickens, and he walked all over and saw the devastation, and he walked right on top of the orchards. Hundreds and hundreds of acres of orchards were completely submerged in gravel and rock and sand, and he walked on the tops of trees so that the top 2 feet or 1 foot of the trees brushed against his ankles, and he was walking over beautiful, once fertile, once bountiful fruit trees, now completely submerged in gravel and rock. He walked on top of farmhouses. He saw fence posts sticking up out of the ground a little bit. He saw devastation on all sides, and he said, this has to stop, and he ruled against the miners. And in 1884, the Lorenzo Sawyer decision brought about this dramatic change in California, and it said to the miner, at last someone said, stop. At last someone said, no more. You can no longer run and manage this state the way you have. Your freedoms are now going to be constrained. And the federal court ruled against the miners and put a stop to hydraulic mining. And at that moment, California changed from a careless place of selfish enterprise and daring enterprise of the miner to the more productive enterprise and the long-term rooted stability of families living on the land and caring for the land and reproducing year after year. And that's when California shifted then from mining to agriculture. And now, of course, we know very well that agriculture is and has been the basis of California's stability, the magnificent economy of California. We should never forget, it isn't movies, it isn't oil, it isn't the Silicon Valley, it's agriculture that's built this state. That magnificent Central Valley, the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, more productive than any other place in all the world. Fresno County produced $10 billion, I think it was last year, more than the gross national product of many nations. California moved from the wealth and the abundance of gold mining to the wealth and the abundance of agriculture. And the story of California is in that transfer, in that evolution, how California became a place of great opportunity and carelessness to a place of equal opportunity and greater responsibility, though I think one might find that farmers can be found fault with today. Maybe they too have developed some arrogance in their power. This book is an attempt to reconsider the gold rush as a cohesive force, a force released in 1848 and 1849 that shaped California through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and shaped it in such a way that by the 1880s, it was a powerhouse, America only more so, a place unlike any other in all the world, a place that had projected an image into the minds of the world. And those images, of course, became more vivid and more attractive because of Hollywood. talk about daring, because of the oil industry in Southern California, because today of the Silicon Valley and the daring entrepreneurial enterprise of the Silicon Valley. Who says no? No one. Who's afraid in the Silicon Valley? There's so many successes in the Silicon Valley. We don't even know about the failures, and the failures are not attended to because they're aware of the successes. So it was when California was young and California was hopeful. Its youth, its ethos of daring enterprise remains today. And I think the beginning of that is to be found in the gold rush decades, and how that became a part of the DNA, a part of the muscle and the spirit of California is the story of the gold rush. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to you. I hope you have questions. That's the most rewarding part for me. If you have a question, there's a microphone that will be given to you. There's a question in the back, in the far back. We'll wait till the question can be heard in the microphone.
Thank you so much. Can you hear it?
Yes, thank you.
For years, I've been struck by the incredible strength that it must have taken to get back into some of those mines. And this past weekend, I was up at Tioga Pass, visiting Bennetville and some of those places. And do you have any explanation for the raw strength that it took to get into those areas with everything they needed to make that happen?
Good point. Yes, the muscle, the mental and physical muscle of being willing and able to get into the canyons and the gullies and the dark recesses of the Sierra Nevada mountains. We're talking about the 1850s and the 60s and the 70s. These are wild places. And the answer, of course, is very nakedly, to put it naked, greed. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than the expectation of suddenly getting a lot of money. And that's exactly what motivated. And the irony of it is that these men who went up into the upper reaches of the Sierra's streams were so careless. Nobody ever done anything like it before. Tens of thousands of these men went up there. They didn't know who was going to bring them food. They didn't know where their new boots were going to come from, where the whiskey, where the blankets, where the tent, where the nails, the shovels, the pickaxes, all that they needed. Where in the world was it going to come from? And it's this great American adaptiveness, this inventiveness of the American spirit that was at play. On the one hand, you have the miner, thousands of them pushing up into that high country, not as high as Tioga Pass. That's not gold mining country. They're far lower than that, but still pretty rough country. And the miners are going up there, and somehow or other they instinctively realize that George and Sam and Louie down there are going to bring me some food. And sure enough, they do. Entrepreneurial spirit of capitalism, whatever I think of it as that, the wonderful ability of the Americans to find a way of making money in all kinds of opportunities. On the Overland Trail by the middle 50s, people were building bridges over the North Platte River, building ferries, building blacksmith shops so that people could make money on the guys who were still going overland from California. We built a railroad. One of the most successful railroads in the history of the world is the Panama Railroad. 449,000 people traveled on that railroad in 14 years. Never been a more successful railroad. Why? Because it was a hell of an opportunity to make money taking people to and from California. It happened to be in somebody else's country, but we weren't stopped by that. So the answer is that there was a spirit of risk-taking and a spirit of opportunism, and they combined to make it possible for mining and all the other enterprises to take place. Similarly, the Comstock Lode, this book has a wonderful... This book has a description, has a description of the Comstock mining operations, and you wouldn't. It's so striking and painful to read of the work that was done 2,000 or 3,000 feet down into the depths, into the torrid depths, the heat, the terrible fires, the explosions. all that was going on, driven by the great expectation of making great fortunes. These guys are working for $4 a day, the miners, but they're planning too. They're going to save a little bit. They're buying stock. God, the stock markets, there were 6 stock markets in San Francisco. The stock markets were selling stock on the stocks of the mining companies in the Virginia City. Tremendous amount of money being made there and so on. So your question, I'm giving you too long an answer, but it's evocative of what we're talking about. It is everywhere there was difficulty, but there were very few obstacles that weren't overcome by ambition and by greed. And again I say, there was nobody here to say no. The trees were cut down because the government couldn't survey them and didn't control the destruction of the forest. The rivers were destroyed. No one in these years was here to say no, and we built California with ruthlessness in a very short period of time because of this freedom. Yes, thank you. The lady with the jacket on.
Of the so-called first 8,000, were most of them from America, or had others come from Europe already?
The 8,000 people that I mentioned who were here in California in 1846 were all, this is in 1846, let's see, by 1848, the total non-Indian population of California was, we aren't sure, maybe 11,000 people. Of those, well, let's deal with 1848. Of the 11,000 people who were here, non-Indians, settlers, about 2,000, maybe 3, and of course nobody knows because there's no census, this is a very primitive place. Mexico never kept any track of how many people were here, certainly Spain didn't. So maybe 3,000 were foreigners. Of the 3,000, 2,000 were American, 1,000 were from Europe, and the remaining 8,000 were all from Mexico. Now, Mexicans didn't come to California willingly. Father Serra wrote letters and complained that the people who were sent to California were taken out of jails and brought up here. So California did not attract people, and that was the point I was making at the outset. So the Californios, who were the native, the non-Indian natives of California, were 8 to 9,000 of them who lived on the great ranchos, who had inherited the land from the missions. And these people were the population of California that we came into conflict with, we, the American government, the American people, when we took over and conquered California, and California became the 31st state in 1850. The native population was largely in Southern California on the great ranchos, and the Americans came in by the tens and scores of thousands. The world rushed in, and we had 380,000 people here by 1860, and they were in the big cities, and they were in the mining camps, and the original natives, the original Californios, were living down on the ranchos in Southern California, and they were mostly of a Mexican descent. Yes, sir.
In talking about the evolution of mining technology, you had that wonderful phrase about a marriage of greed and technology, and you talked about the hydraulic mining, which, you know, you can hear that phrase, but unless you've been to a place like Malakoff Diggins and you've seen what that really is, I don't think anybody can grasp what it was really doing to the landscape. I mean, that looks like a little Bryce Canyon or something, but it strikes me that that's probably not something that a small-scale, individual-level mining, entrepreneur can do. Can you talk about the change from in the economics and in the organization of the ownership and that type of thing?
Yes, the gentleman is commenting on the remarkable site at Malakoff Diggings, which maybe some of you have seen, which is north of Nevada City. Let me comment on that first, and then he also mentions that's of course industrialization. That's the industrialization of mining. And how did the industrialization develop is the question. But when you go to the Malakoff Diggings, one of the most remarkable aspects is that we don't see the wonder. You think the wonder is that those great cliffs, that wound, that vast, horrible wound on the landscape, which is now being camouflaged by the growth of bushes and trees, which seems to me the state parks ought to get rid of the bushes and trees, which are no value, and leave the naked wonder of the place to give you full visual impact. But what's so amazing about the Malakoff Diggings is you don't see, and that is the tunnel that was dug, the tunnel which was 7,820 feet long. 7,000, that's a mile and a half. Dug at 75, 80 feet down in solid slate, solid rock all the way through for a mile and a half. dug by hand with men with hammers, with drills and black powder explosions, cutting 6, 8, 10 inches, 12 inches a day for 2 years. They cut that whole tunnel, and they carried the gravel and the rock and the sand washed down from those hilltops and carried it down into the tunnel and through the sluices, and it emptied into Humbug Canyon and then into the South Fork of the Yuba River and on down, and carried millions of tons of gravel and rock and sand, which destroyed the river. And it's that tunnel that made Malakoff digging so successful. We only see the surface of it. So that was an industrialization that took about $1 million to develop it. As this gentleman points out, that was the kind of corporate activity. That's the kind of capital-intensive effort that hydraulic mining involved. But there were always ways in which small partnerships and individual enterprises continued. Bret Hart's wonderful stories, romantic as they are, depict the miner and his partners in the 1860s and 70s still working away with the old-fashioned long toms and the rockers and the simple methods of the past. In deep mining, in quartz mining, in hard rock mining, you have hard rock mining. All the mining I've been talking about is placer mining, where the gold has been geologically separated from its geological environment, so that when you uncover the gold, it's free. You pick it up, it's free in every sense of the word. In quartz mining, when you dig down into the ground, you find the gold, and it's locked in its geologic environment, and you have to cut out great chunks of it and bring it up and crush it and process it and put it through chemical processes in order to separate the gold from the geology. That takes ever-increasing technology, the stamp mill and the different methods by which the chemicals were used to separate the gold. So by the 1860s and 70s, gold mining had become an industrialized effort. It had developed, it had matured from a treasure hunt to an industry. And that process is, again, what's told in this book. And it is a process that resulted in great industrialization of California. Heavy industry. There were 52 big foundries in San Francisco and Sacramento. The fires, by the way, when the fires burned, they swept through the cities, they left behind all kinds of melted iron and not steel, melted iron. And they gathered all that melted iron up and sold it and cast it into the machinery that was used up in the mines. So there were so many different ways of choosing opportunities and then making money. But industrialized mining, in hydraulic mining, in river mining, in quartz mining, it required science and technology, and developed, of course, unemployment as a consequence of technological development, because the hydraulic operation could do with 3 men managing a monitor, could wash millions and millions of tons of gravel and rock and sand, which would have taken umpteen lifetimes for 50 or 60 men to do. Yes. Thank you. The blue shirt?
As a follow-up from that first question, I was up in the Sierra Buttes last week, about 40 miles north of Truckee, and you climb up there to an elevation of 8,500 feet, and you can look out over hundreds of hills and mountains, and you see there were mines here and there, one over here, one over there, one someplace else. It wasn't near any stream, and the question is, how on earth did those men who were not metallurgists or geologists, they were merchants or farmers from back east, how would they decide that this is the place they would dig a mine?
Well,
and they'd be successful mines.
Yes. Well, they weren't all, yes. How could it be in the vast emptiness, no, in the vast forested hills, the vast wonder of the wilderness of the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, that here and there and over, here and there were little pockmarks on the hillside where a group of men decided, aha, this is it, this is the place. And the reason was that in hard rock mining and quartz mining, there are locations where the quartz is on the surface, where the vein, which may go down, you don't know how far, thousands of feet or maybe a few hundred feet, but the quartz vein in which the gold is locked is on the surface, and you can see it. And every so often, all over, up and down the Sierra, still today, you can find outcroppings, as they're called, of quartz. And those outcroppings of quartz have oxidized. The gold has been affected by millions of years of rain and freezing and hot and cold, and it has resulted in the gold having been broken free by the action of nature from the quartz that it's set in, and you can separate the gold rather simply and rather easily in these outcroppings. So the initial amount of gold that you find on the outcroppings would allow you to take out 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever numbers of ounces of gold rather quickly and very easily. And then you have to go down, and once you get down and you get below the area where oxygen has oxidized the quartz, you then find the gold much more difficult to separate. And the further down you go, you've got to keep digging it out and you keep bringing it up. So that you say, how do they know? They know mostly by hope. Mostly by expectation, by determination, by God damn it, I'm sure we'll find it here attitude. And it's not necessarily going to always be resulting in success. But the specific and honest and straightforward answer is that they would find an outcropping of quartz. As you said, it's way up on a hillside. It's not down along the rivers. Now, the other kind of gold that they might find is in the alluvial beds of ancient rivers. The rivers that flowed from north to south along the eastern slope of what is now the Sacramento Valley. Those rivers flowed 20 million, 30 million years ago. They were immense rivers. They laid down a bed of gravel, rock, and sand 20, 30, 150, 200 feet deep. And it's that gravel, rock, and sand in which are to be found specks and particles of gold. And it's those great, vast reaches of alluvium, of auriferous gravel that were washed for hydraulic mining, and they're still there. You can find them all over the face of cliffs today. There's billions of dollars in gold all through that country today, but you can't use it. The government estimated at the time of the 1884 lawsuit 700 million cubic yards of auriferous gravel just on the Yuba River. And in that they could take out gold. By the way, I have a statistic. It took 69,000 gallons of water to separate gold worth $1 from the gravel, rock, and sand. There were the reservoirs built by the hydraulic mining companies, reservoirs built up in the Sierra Nevada. Nobody said you can't do this. They dammed up the river. They built their own reservoirs. They drained from the reservoirs, 5,000 some miles of stream, 5,600 miles of ditches, flumes, and aqueducts to carry the water to the hydraulic mining operations. There were 16 billion cubic feet of water in those reservoirs. Think what that did to the rivers downstream that didn't ever get that water. Nobody said no. Nobody could prevent that happening. Yes, sir. On the aisle?
I was interested in two questions. One is, what was the average life of tenure of the average miner? Were they up there for a couple of years, or do you have any kind of profile of that in any regard? And secondly, what was the amount of moving up and down, the 49er, Highway 49 area? How much mobility was there between the camps and so forth? Or did people pretty much go up in one area, try it out, and then either stay or leave?
Awfully good question. The question is how long did the people stay in a given area, and how much did they move around? The first point in your question implies the answer. This is a highly mobile, transient society. They're on the move all the time. If you don't make it on the Yuba, I hear you can make it on the Feather. If you can't make it on the Colony, by God, I hear they're striking it rich over in the Consumnes. There's always somebody moving and going from here to there because of the story of success. So their mobility is very great. I can't think of his first name, Professor Orsi, who is here, and he can tell you, I'm sure, but there's a man named Professor M-A-N-N. His last name is Mann, and he did a history of Nevada City, and among the statistics that he has is that very question answered of how many men there were in terms of how long they stayed in Nevada City. The mobility was very, very great. And as I recall, his statements there were that the population of Nevada City literally turned over about every 3 or 4 years. Now, this is because, I mentioned it earlier, there are not very many women here. Women are essential to stability. You put thousands of men together, and you're going to just get a hell of a mess of a society, and there's no question about it. And they live, and they don't want to bathe, they don't attend to themselves, and they're just selfish. And it's like a great camp out without the scoutmaster, you know? They're just... So they're all on the move all the time, and they're on the move because there's no reason to stay put. Everything is built with temporariness. There's no architecture with the design for longevity. Everything is improvised. Secondly, they are, well, I'm answering your question, they are also on the move all the time. They constantly, the system by which they moved were trails. The government didn't build any roads. One of the ways people made money, I mentioned making money, one of the great ways to make money was to build a toll road. Boy, they built toll roads all over the place. And to build toll bridges, not the government, the individual, entrepreneurial. They would lay out a road from here to there, and they'd charge a guy for taking his mules, his wagons, on that road. You want to go across a river? It's a hell of a lot easier to go across a bridge and even pay some money than to have to ferry it across. And so toll bridges and toll roads were constructed all up and down the western slopes of the Sierra, and that facilitated people moving constantly. And then, of course, the great way to move was on the river. No roads yet, no railroads yet. Don't get any railroads until, well, the Central Pacific doesn't get really established in California until the 1870s. So the great way to get back and forth from San Francisco to Sacramento is on these wonderful, magnificent steamboats. I am telling you, I want to read about the side wheel steamers, mirrors, chandeliers, and best of all, thousands of men, don't forget, thousands of young men from all over the world, farmers from Indiana, farmers from Germany, and they go on board these steamboats, and they go down from Sacramento to San Francisco, and my God, there are bars, there are chandeliers, there are mirrors, and there are women with their bosoms barely hidden, and cigars and drinking and smoking. For a young guy from Indiana, I'm telling you, I'm from Indiana, I'll tell you, this is just knock your socks off. This is why they stayed in California. And to find a woman standing at a bar, drinking, smoking, laughing, my God, I mean, that sounds, you know, today we're so sophisticated, but in that day and age, California was sinful. That's why it was sinful, because women were drinking and smoking and gambling and tempting men. Yes, the red shirt. Wait a minute, if you would.
Thank you. What do you think the effect on California was of those who couldn't go home?
I didn't hear the first of the question.
The effect on California of the people who couldn't go home. California had changed them to the point where they weren't really fit to go home.
Well, not so much. The question is, what was the effect of California on California of the many thousands who chose not to go home? Well, first of all, they could go home. I suppose some got drunk and alcoholism and disease and one thing and another, and there were certainly suicides and there was certainly great disappointment. But as I'm suggesting, California was a place of success, not a place of failure, and that's why they stayed here in California, and that's why people continued to come. Every year, the statistics, we have them, are perfectly precise. 25, 27, 28, 30,000 people went home year after year after year. No question about it. They all went home out of San Francisco. They all went home by steamer down to Panama until finally the railroad came. And when the railroad was here, they were about 22 to 23,000 went home by the railroad every year. So people were going home, but the population of California is continually growing. 340,000 in 1860, 560,000 in 1870. 39% of the people in California in 1870 were foreign-born. 39% of the people in California were foreign-born, not born in the 31 states, 34 states. So the people who came to California planning to leave, a great many of them ended up staying, and they become the old-timers. They become the people who said, I'm on board, pull up the ladder attitude. And so they become the kind of people who, in some degree, represent stability. Yes.
Well, two quick questions. The miners, as you say, were wildly entrepreneurial, free, did whatever they wanted. But when they actually settled down in the mining camps, didn't they really develop an amazing system of self-government? One often hears that this is the Anglo-Saxon genius for self-government, for running themselves, and that the mining camps were in many ways, if not disciplined, at least somewhat orderly. And then the second question is, you mentioned the Sawyer case. Isn't the Miller, Lux, Hagen, Tevis change in the water law also a great sign of the shift of California to a modern world?
Yes, good. First question is the degree to which the mining camps evolved self-government and a judicial system of some degree of law and order. Yes, indeed they did. Charles Shin is a great writer on that subject, and the suggestion that the goal that California is a place that exemplifies the American genius for self-government. Well, Royce, I think, gives a pretty good answer to that. The evidence, I think, is quite clear. First of all, the purpose of mining camps was utterly utilitarian and utterly and totally selfish, to find a way to get as much money as fast as possible and leave. So law and order was expedient and improvised and utterly impatient. And the means by which the law and order was imposed reflected those characteristics. You cut the guy's ear off, you brand him, you whip him, and if it's really necessary, you quickly decide to hang him. And the vigilance committees in every single camp, and it's no question about it, all the camps had vigilance committees. Sacramento had a vigilance committee. San Francisco had two great vigilance committees. The one in 51 and the one in 56 ran the city, displaced the mayor, told the governor to stay out of the picture, and ran this place. I don't look upon those as examples of self-government in any way that is reflective of the criteria we use today. The government that was established, even the state government, and certainly the local governments, were designed to serve the interests of the miners. And they did so because the miner was here first, and he was the dominant force, and he was the producer of wealth, and he had the image of power and the reality of power. So the mining camps, to the extent that they had a law and order system, were places where people made decisions to serve their best interests, their own selfish interests, as rapidly as they could. The foreign miners tax, which always comes to mind as an example of discrimination, was essentially not an act of discrimination, but an economic act, a way of finding some way for the state government to collect money, because they didn't have any. The miners, after all, didn't own property. They never owned the land they were digging on. They just had a claim. They never, when the government offered them the right to buy title to the land, very few people bought title. Why buy title to the land? There may not have any gold on it, and once you've taken the gold, you don't want to bother with the land. You take the gold and leave. So there were no taxes. Foreign miners tax was designed to produce wealth, not wealth, to produce some income for the federal government, and it was applied against the Mexicans and then rescinded and brought back and applied against the Chinese and so on. So law and order was effectively designed to serve the immediate interests of the mining interests at that time. The Miller-Lux case, which is, I'm not sure I can bring to mind how the complexity of it, it's riparian rights against appropriation rights. And it has to do with the right of water use. And Dick Orsi will tell better than I. I'm going to cop out on that. I can't give you an honest, no, I could give you an honest answer, but I can't give an informed answer as to how, but I think you're probably right. It was an important ruling in terms of developing agriculture, and it probably was instrumental in allowing large-scale agriculture as compared to small individual small farms. Miller and Lux and Chapman developed massive acreage, and those large land developments were the consequence of water use, and the water use was designed to protect the interests of the big landowners, just as the mining laws were designed to protect the interests of the mining industry. So there is a parallel. Yes, thank you. The lady with the blue sweater.
This may First, I'd like to congratulate you for doing so well in the Chronicles nonfiction Western authors list.
Oh, I was astonished. Thank you.
And second, at the time of the Oakland Museum exhibits last year, like May, etc., till June or whenever, the San Mateo County Times had an article saying about you, saying that this book, presumably this book, would be coming out like before Christmas. Did you decide to add more, or does it just take a little longer to put together?
This lady remembers what pains me to remember. This book was supposed to be published on the 24th of January of 1998, which was the 150th anniversary of the discovery of gold, which was the opening date for the Gold Rush exhibition produced by the Oakland Museum. I was the historical consultant on it. I promised to have this book ready at that time, and I failed miserably, to the dismay and the horror and the shock and the anguish of the Oakland Museum, and my anguish as well. The book didn't get finished until 12 o'clock midnight on January 4th of 1999, this year, because I write lugubriously. I am desperately slow, and I rewrite and so on and so forth. So the book didn't come out, not because I added to it, just because I wasn't smart enough to get it finished on time. And it got finished finally, as I say, in January of this year. I guess the time has come to say goodnight. All right, I've got to thank you. You've been wonderful. I'm grateful to you.
Hi. Great talk. Really loved it.
How nice of you. I appreciate
Really interesting.
it. How good of you.
I'm a Sacramento native.
Oh, good.
Now I'm going to have to go back.
Now, there's a lot in here about Sacramento. We never pay enough attention to Sacramento. It's a
I like
wonderful
when you
city.
said that.
Yeah. What is your name?
Scott.
And your last name?
It's Menefee. M-E-N-E-F-E-E. Yeah, as a kid, we did a little archaeological dig down to the basement level of old Sacramento and saw where, the original city was.
Right.
We found bottles and stuff from that era.
Well, you know, it took an immense sort of arrogance and courage to just say we're going to raise the whole goddamn city, and they did. You know, it's just remarkable.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate your being here.
Jim, I've got one of your books already, but I'm getting this for a gift.
Oh, how nice
from my
of you.
cousin.
Wonderful.
So I wanted you to write this, if you would.
Of course I will.
To Jim.
What, shouldn't I put his last name?
No, you don't need. Well, Sherman.
Well, I
his
don't
last
know
name.
him, so let
from
me-
Jim Sherman. Jim Sherman. S-H-E-R-M-A-N.
Yep.
And then from one lover of Western history to another on the occasion of your retirement. From one lover of Western history to another on the occasion of your retirement.
That was so well done.
And you can say congratulations, best wishes.
Thank you.
He'll get a big kick out
How
of that.
nice
Thanks
of
a
you.
lot.
Appreciate
Okay,
you getting
good.
the book. Thank you.
Where are you from in Indiana? I'm another
Indianapolis?
Hoosier.
Oh, are you?
You ever heard of
The
Lebanon?
heartbeat of America.
That's it.
Lebanon.
Jim Layton.
I used to go to Lebanon. It was a naughty town. When I
Oh,
went.
was it really?
It
Well, I
was.
wasn't
It was
there.
the only naughty
Yeah.
town around. I remember it very
Lebanon,
well.
that's
Sure.
So
How,
it's-
and you were from, when did you leave there?
I left in '64.
Oh, yeah,
I went to
well.
Purdue, and
Oh,
once I
did you?
got out of
Sure,
Purdue,
yeah.
I got out.
Well, I was born in Indianapolis in 1928, and we left in 34.
And came out here?
No, then various
other
other
places,
places.
okay.
Yeah. What is your name?
Jim, you got that part easy, and it's Latham, Latham. But I certainly enjoyed the first book, When the World Rushed In. That was wonderful. Didn't know you were a Hoosier then, see? Okay,
Thank
certainly
you.
enjoyed the evening.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
very
lot.
much.
Yeah.
Appreciate your being here. Okay. How nice of you. Look at you. Good for you. How nice.
I certainly enjoyed your wonderful talks last year at the Open Museum of Humanities West.
Oh, yes, yes. How did it hold up tonight?
Oh, this was good too. And I guess I would say again, the question I asked probably Humanities West, or maybe Open Museum, is wouldn't you say that what you were talking about tonight goes a long way toward explaining what happened to the American Indians, the extermination?
Oh, sure. I didn't get into that because there wasn't time.
No, I know you
but
didn't,
it's
but at
absolutely.
the time, I mean, it just, you know,
They were wiped out. Nobody cared. There was nobody here to defend them.
And nobody, in one of the discussions, nobody was really bringing up that, well, it was this environment. It was this environment in which there was no law, no
That's
order.
right. Yeah, exactly.
I was seeing something in one of the local papers just about murder rates. They were talking about, you know, current murder rates and how they compared in LA,
Higher
San
then.
Francisco, higher by, you know, by thousands.
Exactly. That's
They were
right. Particularly
enormous,
LA.
all over.
That's
yeah.
true. That's true. Who's this for?
Just put your name in.
Oh dear.
I don't want to for.
Oh dear. I started right for somebody. Neither one of them.
Well, I guess you could, well, you could put for my cousin, I guess, poor Raymond.
I don't want to force you into it.
No, I wasn't really planning for it. I'll tell you what, suppose that I just get one that doesn't have a 4.
Well, I just put the 4 on it. Maybe somebody else wants to. Do you want me to sign a book for you?
I have my review copy.
Rush for Riches is J.S. Holliday's second book. It's published by the University of California Press in Berkeley.